The air in Westminster that morning was heavy, though the summer sun outside was clear and bright. The council chamber smelled faintly of ink, hot wax, and the damp wool of cloaks still drying from the river mist. Quills scratched softly on parchment, and the murmurs of men who had ruled England for decades rose and fell like the tide. Routine, familiar, almost lulling. Thomas Cromwell sat among them, his hands folded neatly on the table, his eyes scanning the room with the instinctive wariness of a man who had survived every storm the Tudor court had hurled his way. From the forge of Putney to the pinnacle of power, he had climbed on a staircase built of other men's ruins. He had orchestrated the fall of cardinals and queens, torn England from the Pope's embrace, and filled the royal coffers with the spoils of monasteries. He had stared into the abyss of politics and taught it to blink first. But this morning, something was wrong. It was nothing tangible at first, just a stiffness in the air, a slight hesitation in the way the others met his gaze. A ripple passed through the chamber, invisible but unmistakable, as if every man present had heard a whisper he had not. Then the scrape of a chair. The Duke of Norfolk rose, his voice sharp and deliberate, cut through the chamber like a drawn blade. "My lords, I bring grave charges of treason and heresy against the Earl of Essex." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat, suspended in the stunned silence. Cromwell's mind, so quick, so deadly in its prime, seemed to stumble. Treason, heresy. The twin hounds that had chased so many of his enemies into the tower now snapped at his own heels. Guards moved before he could form his reply. Cold iron clamped around his wrists. His staff of office was torn from his hand, his garter insignia ripped from his breast. The noise of the chamber, the scrape of boots, the flutter of papers, became a distant roar like the sea in his ears. As they dragged him from the table, he saw the faces of men who had once sought his favor, now turned to stone. No one moved. No one spoke. In the Tudor court, silence was the sound of survival. Down the corridor, past the sunlit windows, he caught a glimpse of the Thames glinting in the distance, the river that had carried him to triumph and would now bear him toward his ruin. And in that moment, Thomas Cromwell understood the truth that had always been waiting for him at the heart of power. The king's hand could raise you higher than you'd ever dreamed, and with the same hand, in the same breath, he could let you fall. Part 1. From Forge to Throne. He came into the world not with a cry and a silk-draped cradle, but with the hiss of steam rising from a forge. Putney, around 1485, a riverside village that smelled of mud, wood smoke, and hot iron. The blacksmith's hammer was the heartbeat of the street, its metallic clang echoing from dawn until darkness. Thomas Cromwell grew up in that rhythm, watching sparks leap like fireflies in the shadows. His father's arms were as thick as the anvil, and his temper struck even faster. In that cramped cottage, love was a rare luxury, discipline a daily certainty. One night, perhaps the most important night of his life, the boy staggered away from the forge with his face bloodied and his ribs aching from another beating. He didn't stop at the edge of the village. He kept walking until the roads grew strange, until the air smelled of the sea, until the only thing behind him was the faint glow of the fire he had been born to, but would never serve again. He was barely a man when he crossed the channel. Yet he carried himself with the restless energy of someone who knew England held no crown for him, so he would have to find one elsewhere. The next decade remade him. In the French wars, he learned how a man's life could be bought for a silver coin and spent in a heartbeat. In the markets of Antwerp, he learned the language of merchants, how to weigh silk with one hand while weighing a man's honesty with the other. In Florence, he stood under high painted ceilings and read Machiavelli's words as if they were scripture. That power is not given, it is taken. That mercy is a coin spent only when it buys more than it costs. In Venice, he saw gold cross the tables of the great trading houses faster than vows could be sworn, and he learned that loyalty in politics was as fluid as water in the gutter. By the time he returned to England, he was no longer the runaway son of a blacksmith. He was a man of languages, of law, of trade, and of survival. His purse was full, his mind sharper than any blade, and his ambition was a thing with claws. The first great door he pushed open belonged to Cardinal Wolsey, the king's chief minister, the man who seemed to hold the keys to every treasure and every throne. Cromwell entered not as a courtier with fine manners, but as a weapon to be used. His hands were steady where others shook. His tongue spoke truths in the king's interest, and lies when those truths no longer served. When Henry VIII's longing to rid himself of Catherine of Aragon began to consume the court, Cromwell proved himself indispensable, navigating the labyrinth of canon and civil law, turning centuries of precedent into dust if it suited his master. And when Wolsey fell in 1529, Cromwell did not fall with him. He shed the cardinal's livery like a skin and stepped neatly into the king's shadow, offering himself as the man who could do what others dared not even imagine. By 1532, he was principal secretary, the silent hand that redrafted England's laws, the mind that broke Rome's hold on the realm. Monasteries that had stood for hundreds of years fell like rotten oaks. Their treasures flowed into the royal coffers, their lands parceled out to the king's favorites. Those who opposed, noble or common, found themselves accused of treason on evidence gathered in whispers by Cromwell's growing web of informants. He had built not just influence, but an entirely new shape of power, one born not from lineage, but from skill, calculation, and a fearlessness that bordered on audacity. And yet, beneath the victories, a truth lurked like a shadow at his back. In the Tudor court, the higher a man climbed, the more the ground beneath his feet turned to glass. Part 2. The Unshakable Minister. By the mid-1530s, Thomas Cromwell was no longer simply the king's secretary. He was the pulse beneath the skin of the Tudor court, unseen by the masses, yet dictating its every twitch. In the council chamber, he spoke in the king's voice. In the Star Chamber, he sharpened the laws into weapons. In the shires, sheriffs and justices carried out orders sealed with his authority. If Henry VIII was England's beating heart, Cromwell was the veins through which its power flowed. He understood that in a kingdom where the monarch's will was absolute, proximity was currency. And Cromwell was closer to the king than anyone, closer than the dukes who traced their bloodlines to the Norman conquest, closer than bishops who claimed to speak with God's authority. He had not inherited this closeness. He had built it, brick by brick, with the mortar of necessity. Henry trusted him not out of affection. The king trusted no one that way. but because Cromwell could make the impossible happen. He could turn royal desires into statutes, royal grudges into legal verdicts, royal whims into binding contracts. When the monasteries fell, their bells silenced and their altars stripped, it was Cromwell's network that made it happen. His commissioners moved with military precision, inventorying every chalice and candlestick, every acre of arable land, every roof beam worth salvaging. The wealth they pulled into the crown's coffers was staggering. Gold plate melted down, libraries dispersed, entire villages sold with a stroke of the pen. To the faithful, Cromwell was a butcher of the sacred. To the ambitious, he was the man who could make them rich overnight. He built an intelligence system that was, in essence, England's first modern spy network. From the streets of London to the cloisters of York, his informants listened in taverns, confessionals, and marketplaces. A whispered complaint about the king's marriage could be on Cromwell's desk before the ink dried on the day's warrants. He understood that knowledge was not just power, it was survival. But the same talents that fortified his position also painted a target on his back. The ancient nobility saw him as an interloper, a blacksmith's son who sat where earls had once ruled, who could make and unmake lords with the turn of a seal. In public, they bowed. In private, they sharpened their knives. Cromwell sensed it. You could not survive in Henry's court without sensing it. But he wore his enemies' hatred like a second cloak. He knew that as long as the king needed him, their daggers would stay hidden. And in those years, Henry needed him desperately. The kingdom had been remade in Cromwell's image, leaner, richer, more centralized. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their monarchs that nothing moved in England without his consent. In Parliament, bills he drafted passed like clockwork, their language calculated to bind Crown and Commons alike. It was a kind of power no English commoner had ever held before. It was also, as Cromwell must have known, the most dangerous kind of power, the kind that exists entirely at the mercy of one man's mood. For now, that mood favored him. He was showered with titles, Baron, then Earl of Essex. The Garter ribbon crossed his chest, the ultimate mark of royal favor. His estates multiplied, his wealth rivaling that of families who had been noble for centuries. Yet, even at the height of his power, the court whispered, that the king's favor was a fire. It warmed while you stood close, but burned without warning, that Cromwell's rise was so steep, the fall would be fatal. They were right. They just didn't yet know how close they were to watching it happen. Part 3. The Cleves Mistake. The winter of 1539 carried with it more than frost. It carried fear. England stood alone. Its break from Rome, a wound the Catholic powers longed to close with steel. Emperor Charles V eyed invasion. France's King Francis whispered of alliance with Rome. For Cromwell, the path forward seemed clear. Bind England to the Protestant princes of Germany, and the Catholic jaws would never snap shut. Anne of Cleves was to be the linchpin. She was the sister of the Duke of Cleves, whose alliance with Saxony and other Lutheran states promised both military muscle and diplomatic shelter. Cromwell, the consummate strategist, saw her not as a bride, but as a fortress in silk. The marriage would be a wall against Rome, cold, solid, unbreachable. But Cromwell forgot one thing. Henry VIII did not marry for policy alone. He married for possession, for beauty, for fire. The king's painter Hans Holbein, was dispatched to capture Anne's likeness. The portrait returned to England showed a woman of serene dignity, her eyes calm, her features symmetrical. Henry, squinting at the painting, saw no reason to doubt Cromwell's choice. The betrothal was signed before he had ever heard her voice. Then came January 1st, 1540, the day the king first laid eyes on his bride-to-be. The meeting took place at Rochester. Henry, always eager for the theatrics of romance, arrived in disguise, hoping to surprise her to set the stage for a chivalric tale. But the moment he stepped into the room, the script fell apart. Anne, unfamiliar with English custom and unimpressed by the masked stranger before her, greeted him with polite indifference. No fluttering eyes, no blush of recognition, no courtly flattery. Henry's pride, as fragile as his temper, curdled in an instant. When the truth of his identity was revealed, there was no spark to salvage. Later, in private, Henry spat the words that would haunt Cromwell. "She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported. I like her not. And worse, I could never be stirred to know her carnally." The insult was more than personal. In Henry's mind, Cromwell had deceived him, lured him into a bed he did not want for the sake of a political game. The king's humiliation was the scent of blood in the water. Norfolk and the conservative Catholic faction moved swiftly. They whispered that Cromwell's Protestant sympathies had blinded him to England's true interests, that the marriage had not only shackled the king to a woman he found repellent, but to foreign alliances that bound England to heresy. And then, like a shadow gliding into the king's chambers, came Catherine Howard, Norfolk's young, vibrant niece. She was everything Anne was not: flirtatious, malleable, a spark to the king's cold embers. With every smile, every coy glance, Catherine made Anne's presence more unbearable. The Cleves marriage, once Cromwell's masterstroke, became a chain around his neck. His enemies did not even have to tighten it. They only had to let the king tug at it until he choked. In the spring of 1540, the court began to shift its weight away from Cromwell. Those who once sought his patronage now lingered in Norfolk's shadow. The tide was turning, and for the first time in years, Cromwell felt the pull of the current against him. What he did not yet know was that the current would become a whirlpool, and that the center of it had already formed. Part 4. The trap closes. By late spring of 1540, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were threads, carefully spun, deliberately woven into a noose. The Duke of Norfolk knew Cromwell's fall would not come from one strike, but from 100 small cuts. Each conversation at court was a cut. Each raised eyebrow in the council chamber, a cut. Each report of Cromwell's dealings with Lutheran princes, another. Norfolk's genius was in turning the king's personal disappointment into righteous fury. He told Henry that Cromwell's Protestant ties were not mere diplomacy. They were heresy, poisoning the soul of England. Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, embroidered the accusation with theological silk. Cromwell had coddled heretics, undermined the king's supremacy, and sought to drag England into the arms of Luther. The stage was set. All that was needed was the perfect moment, a day when the king's patience wore thin, when Catherine Howard's youth and beauty whispered of a new beginning, when Anne of Cleves' very presence felt like an insult. That day came on June 10th, 1540. The council met as usual in Westminster, the long table laid with parchments, the sunlight slicing through high windows onto polished wood. Cromwell arrived with the calm of a man who had outlived too many storms to believe in sudden ruin. But the room felt different, colder. Halfway through the session, Norfolk rose. His voice carried no anger, only formality, the kind of formality that meant death. "My lords, I bring before you grave charges of treason and heresy against the Earl of Essex." It happened quickly after that, too quickly for Cromwell to catch his breath. The list of accusations was long, the words sharp. Promoting heresy, conspiring with foreign enemies, deceiving the king in matters of state. Cromwell tried to speak, to demand evidence, to remind them of his service, but his words were drowned by the rustle of movement. Guards stepped forward. Cold steel gripped his wrists. His staff of office was pulled from his hand, the garter insignia ripped from his chest. The polished oak table, the sunlight, the murmurs, they blurred as he was turned toward the door. In Tudor England, there was no sentence more humiliating than chains on a nobleman. Norfolk made sure they were fastened before the entire council. As Cromwell was led out, he looked to the faces he had once fed, promoted, protected. None met his eyes. In the Tudor court, silence was not absence of speech. It was a death sentence. News spread through London faster than a tide could turn. By nightfall, the streets were buzzing with the fall of the blacksmith's son who had ruled like a king. Some cheered, some pitied. All understood. The man who had made himself indispensable had, in a single day, become disposable. And in the cells of the Tower of London, Thomas Cromwell began to understand the cruelest truth of all. His enemies had learned his game, and they were playing it better than he ever had. Part 5, The Tower and the Bill. The Tower did not welcome Cromwell with cruelty. It welcomed him with silence. No guards jeered, no inquisitors shouted. The punishment was colder than that. Calculated, professional, surgical. The kind of punishment only a master of control could recognize. They put him not in some noble's chamber, but in a stone cell meant for common thieves. The walls sweated with cold. The straw stank of rot. The light was a suggestion more than a fact, filtering in like a dying thing through the slit in the stone. He had sent many to cells like this. Now he counted the bricks. Gone were the robes, the titles, the polished words. They gave him rough linen to wear and thin gruel to eat. He lost weight quickly, not just from hunger, but from the weight of what he finally understood. The king would not come. No messenger, no royal hand, no note scribbled in secret, only silence. Outside his cell, the trap tightened. Norfolk and his circle moved fast, wielding not swords, but quills. They drafted a bill of attainder, Parliament's deadliest weapon, a legal fiction that declared a man guilty without trial, without defense, without proof. Treason, heresy, corruption. But what echoed loudest in the corridors of power wasn't the list of charges. It was the method. Cromwell would not be given his day in court. He would not face his accusers. He would be extinguished, legally. Parliament passed the bill with alarming speed. There were no debates, no voices raised in protest. Even Cromwell's former allies, the men he had raised up, the men who owed him lands and legacies, kept their heads down and their mouths shut. The man who had restructured the English legal system now watched it devour him, swift, hungry, and merciless. Back in the Tower, the interrogations began, but they did not bring racks or thumbscrews. They brought words, words sharpened like knives. His interrogators used the same strategies he once perfected. Ask calmly, accuse indirectly, offer sympathy, then twist the blade. They showed him his own letters, distorted, reinterpreted. Conversations with Protestant princes now looked like conspiracies. His diplomatic strategy painted as sedition. Every sentence he had once written now returned like a ghost with blood on its mouth. And worst of all, they sent old allies to visit. One by one, they came. Men who had once hung on his every command, now standing in front of him as strangers. They asked nothing, offered nothing, just looked and left. His strength ebbed, his hair grayed, his hands, once quick with a pen, now trembled in the cold. He still believed deep down that Henry might relent, that all his service, all his victories would count for something. But the only thing that came from Whitehall was the final order. He would die by axe, a small mercy, not drawn and quartered as a traitor should be, just the axe. They told him he could write a final confession. He wrote with dignity, trying to preserve some fragment of himself for the world to remember. To his son, Gregory, he sent words not of revenge, but of warning. To the king, nothing. For what could he say to a God who had forsaken him? Part 6. The Last Walk. Morning broke soft and golden over the Thames on July 28, 1540, the kind of morning that makes a man believe in mercy. But there was no mercy waiting for Thomas Cromwell. The date was chosen with precision. While bells would toll in Whitehall to celebrate King Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard, another set of bells would toll for Cromwell's death. The king's joy and his minister's destruction fused into one perfect symmetry of Tudor cruelty. The guards came without ceremony. They unlocked his cell in the Tower and found him already awake, already dressed in the coarse linen shirt they had given him. In his hands, he held no Bible, no letter, only the knowledge that the walk ahead would be short and final. The great wooden doors groaned open. Sunlight struck his face for the first time in weeks. It was warm, almost gentle, and for a fleeting second, he thought of Putney, of the forge's firelight spilling onto the street, of the boy he had been before he learned how to make and unmake kingdoms. Then the roar reached him. London had come to watch. The narrow lane from the Tower to Tower Hill was packed with bodies, merchants, sailors, noblemen in velvet, fishwives with baskets on their hips. Some jeered, some stared in silence. A few, perhaps, pitied. All knew they were watching a lesson. He walked with the steady gait of a man who understood theater. Every step, every glance, every measured breath said, "You may take my life, but you will not take my composure." The scaffold stood high and bare against the sky, the axe glinting in the morning light. The executioner waited, his hands resting on the haft, his eyes avoiding Cromwell's. The man had been paid for one clean stroke, mercy in its most economical form. Cromwell mounted the steps without faltering. From that height, he could see the Thames glittering like liquid steel. He could see London Bridge, where his head would soon be displayed, a warning to anyone who thought themselves indispensable to a king. The crowd hushed as he began to speak. His voice carried, steady, formal, shaped by years of command. He praised the king. He asked for no revenge. He confessed no treason. It was the speech of a man who understood that words could still be a kind of armor. When he knelt, the wood was cold beneath his knees. He folded his hands. He whispered something, Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a memory. The axe fell, a clean stroke. The executioner lifted the head high for all to see. Blood darkened the planks. The roar of the crowd swelled, then ebbed into murmurs as the body was taken away. By midday, Cromwell's head was mounted on a spike above London Bridge, rain clouds gathering behind it. The river below carried the reflection of that pale face, the face of a man who had built an empire in another man's name, only to be erased from it in the space of a morning. And in Whitehall, as the wedding feast began, Henry VIII laughed loudly at something Catherine Howard had said, as if the scaffold at Tower Hill had been nothing more than a forgotten shadow. Part 7. Aftermath and Regret. For a while, the court pretended nothing had changed. Cromwell's name was spoken only in the past tense, as if he were a sickness England had purged from its body. The spoils of his destruction were divided swiftly. Lands to Norfolk's allies, offices to hungry courtiers, his titles swallowed into the royal vault. Men who had trembled in his presence just weeks before now walked the palace corridors with a freer step. The blacksmith's son was gone. But a strange thing began to happen. Problems started piling up, small at first, then heavier, like snow on a roof. Foreign ambassadors complained of unanswered letters. The Treasury stumbled in, balancing its accounts. Legal reforms that had once flowed like clockwork became snarled in petty disputes. The king noticed. Henry had always been proud of his own mind, but even he could not ignore the void Cromwell had left behind. The Protestant alliance Cromwell had so carefully built with the German princes dissolved like mist at sunrise. Catholic powers circled again, sensing England's isolation. The machinery of state slowed, and the man who had known how to keep it running was now a headless corpse beneath the Thames clay. Rumors crept through the corridors that the king muttered Cromwell's name when frustrated, that he blamed false counsel for the execution. Whether from genuine regret or simply the sting of inconvenience, Henry began to speak of his minister differently. It was said that one evening, after a particularly disorderly council session, he turned to a servant and said, "I have lost the best servant I ever had." But regret in the Tudor court was a sterile thing. It could not resurrect the dead, could not return the severed head from London Bridge. It could only gnaw in silence. Cromwell's enemies, so adept at tearing him down, proved clumsy at ruling without him. The wealth he had drawn from the monasteries dwindled into the pockets of the nobility. The efficiency he had imposed on government melted back into the chaos of factional rivalry. And through it all, the lesson of his fall hung over the court like a shadow no sunlight could burn away. That power in Henry's England was never truly yours. It was a gift on loan from a man whose favor could shift like the wind. And when it turned, it could cut through flesh and bone in a single stroke. Years later, when historians dug into the wreckage of that reign, they found Cromwell's legacy buried under layers of vilification and praise, myth and record. Some saw him as a reformer, others as a tyrant, but all agreed on one truth. He had built the machine that killed him, and the echo of that truth still lingers even now, in the quiet corridors of power, where men still believe they are indispensable until the moment they are not.